let's go deep into the core of this presentation with just a little reminder of what Policy Tracker is and was until we launched the second version a few weeks ago. So basically, just a refresher for the platform as it used to be until the 18th of February. We had three main interfaces. The first one was a policy database where you can find analysis of more than 27 EU and international policies related to CDR. That means concretely, for example, if you want to know more about the Green Claims Directive, which Thibault will talk about more in his part of our presentation, you find in a nutshell what it is and why it's important to CDR, then what's on the horizon, what's coming next, and then a deep dive into some key issues related to this policy, for example, where there would be places to improve or to make this policy even more impactful for CDR. This was the first part. The second part was that we did a comparison of the European and American policy frameworks related to CDR across 6 different topics, like government procurement, deployment incentives. And we did that with the World Resources Institute. They covered the American part of the analysis. We did the European part of the analysis. And then together, we drew some key points of comparison across these 6 topics. And then finally, the third part was that we are currently monitoring policy developments across 31 European countries, namely the 27 European member states, and then Iceland, UK, Switzerland, and Norway. And there you can find a brief overview of what CDR, what's the position of CDR within the national climate policy, environment, then relevant legal frameworks around CDR, research, development, and innovation, financial support, and then finally, what's coming up next. So this was already there, and now I will briefly present what we added on top and then key insights from our new analysis. So yeah, here is the new homepage of Policy Tracker, so the 2.0 version. And as I said, we launched it on the 18th of February with 2 new interfaces. The first one is a funding tracker, and the second one is a policy progress tracker. I'll go first with the funding tracker to explain you a bit how we built it and what you can find on it. So basically, for now, the scope of this funding tracker is public funding opportunities for CDR at the European Union and national level. And for now, at the national level, we have data for 10 European countries, including Germany, Finland, the UK, and Switzerland, for instance. What you can find on the platform is currently more than 620 either past or upcoming funding opportunities for CDR. We went as extensive as possible, so 620 might seem like quite a lot compared to what's actually the current funding landscape. And we also mapped funding opportunities that were not directly related to CDR, but indirectly, like, for example, initiatives that were funding a CO2 infrastructure project or places where CDR is indirectly impacted by this funding opportunity. There are 30 funding opportunities that are open right now. So that means that, for instance, if you are a startup looking for funding, you can go on our platform and you will find 30 funding opportunities that could be relevant for you in your specific setting. And what you can find on the platform is both when the funding opportunity closes, what it is about, which CDR method it is relevant for, what kind of technological readiness level this funding opportunity targets, and then also, of course, the hyperlink to the direct funding opportunity. So it's basically made easy for you to just scan through, look at which funding opportunities are relevant for you, and then you just click on it. It directs you to the page, and there you can proceed to applying to this funding opportunity. As I said, we covered 10 countries. We will cover more in the future, so stay on the watch for this. And just to give you an overview also, based on the data that we have gathered, we can also create some graphs and represent the data we found in graphical ways. And I like to present this one because it's actually quite interesting to see. Here we look at direct funding for CDR, namely funding that only serves the purpose of developing a CDR method. And we see that Denmark and Sweden together comprise almost 90% of all the funding that has been attributed to CDR in Europe, which basically means that all the other countries together, including the EU, are kind of dwarfed by these two countries. And this can be explained very concretely by the fact that these are the only two countries currently in Europe that have set deployment incentives for CDR, and that means that they have set aside quite a large amount of funding for the sole purpose of and advancing CDR options in their countries. So yeah, we have also other types of data, other types of graphs, and if there could be any that could be useful to you, feel free to always send us a message as well, and we can see how to create this on the website. Just a quick methodology point. There might be questions around this, so I preempt your questions. So basically, just to briefly touch on three of the most important categories of the database, we have, first of all, how we categorize CDR methods. We stayed at a quite high-level category groups, like, for example, direct air capture or construction material. And then these can be combined together to be a bit more specific. For example, if we look at DAC, and then we add storage infrastructure, together that becomes DAX, and then that narrows down the options. We did this so our database could be more flexible, and also we thought it would be better to stack different tags together rather than having very specific and niche tags for each funding opportunity. So that's also something that makes it more user-friendly as well. Then I mentioned direct and indirect funding quite a lot already. So just to clarify, direct funding is something that's directly related towards developing a removal method itself. And then indirect funding is everything around it that produces spillover effects to removal methods and the ecosystem at large, such as developing CO2 transport and storage, infrastructure, or strengthening MRV systems. And then finally, just a brief note around technological readiness level, we didn't use the usual one, which is like TRL 1, TRL 2, TRL 3. We kind of did a hybrid model where we look at concept, pre-demonstration, demonstration, deployment, and all stages combined. This way, it's a bit more self-explanatory, and we don't need to explain it in more detail. And also, different countries use different nomenclature, so we tried to have one that can be applied to all geographies at once. Now, let's switch to the second new tool, which is the CDR Policy Progress Tracker. It's a new framework that we have adapted based on our our vision for an EU CDR strategy that we launched about a year ago now, where we had 7 different pillars in the strategy. Now, for the Policy Progress Tracker and the Policy Tracker, we have 8 pillars. I will just briefly mention them. So we have, of course, developing a CDR strategy, setting targets for CDR and for climate in general, then clarifying the rules of the game, as we call it, which is to make sure, for example, that we can do a specific type of claims only, and this will be touched upon by my colleague later. Then we have developing physical infrastructure around CO2, supporting research, development, and innovation, introducing dedicated deployment incentives, securing an enduring policy framework, which by that we mean anything that's related to compliance regimes or how to embed CDR into existing legislation. And then finally, ensuring just governance and deployment. Now, if we take a step back, why did we even create this new way of looking at CDR policy in Europe? The main reason is to be able to both compare or like highlight within a country. So, for example, within Denmark, in which sectors is this country doing well and which sectors should it be focusing on in priority? For example, in the case of Denmark, based on our assessment, we see that they should focus more on the last indicator, which is ensuring just governance and deployment, because they are more or less on track, or at least showing clear signs of progress on all the other 7. So that's one reason. And then the second reason is to be able to compare between countries themselves. So for example, if we just care about who has introduced dedicated deployment incentives in Europe, we can use the framework to very quickly see, okay, Denmark has, but France and Finland are only showing early signs of progress, for example. So these are the main 2 use cases for our framework, let's say. Now, if we just go one step deeper into the framework, so as I said, we have 8 big pillars or indicators, and then each indicators are broken down into sub-indicators. for example, in the case of setting targets, this looks like this. So we have setting target as an indicator, and then below setting target, we have 5 different sub-indicators that show what setting targets means basically according to us. So for example, in this case, it means that the country needs to have a climate neutrality target, intermediate targets, separate emission reductions, and CDR targets. And then within the CDR target, a target for durable and non-durable CDR, and then a net negative target. And then we did that for all other 7 indicators. So if you are interested into that, you can go on the website. I will not spend too much time on this now, because I think what you are most interested about is kind of what we can draw from our analysis. So I'll go into this slide, which shows an overview of what we were able to gather using our framework. Just as a reminder, we covered 9 countries so far with this framework, being Italy, Germany, France, the UK, Sweden, Finland, Denmark, and Switzerland. I believe that's 9, maybe I forgot one. And if we just look at 3 different kinds of insights. So first of all, what's the state of play at the moment in Europe? We see a growth of dedicated CDR policy and strategies around Europe, and basically an overall rising on the agenda of CDR as a common trend. And then a second one, we see that some countries are taking the lead on setting targets or setting rules, and some others, like Poland, for example, which I think is an interesting case, are more focused on developing a strong physical infrastructure for CO2. So that means storage and transport. But on the other sectors, they are lagging behind. So we see also kind of specialization, or at least more advanced focused on some indicators rather than a comprehensive strategy on all indicators. In terms of bright spots, or like the indicators that we saw were the most on track across Europe, we had climate neutrality and intermediate targets. And we think this is mostly due to the fact that, for example, in the European Union, we have this European Union level climate neutrality target by 2050, which has trickled down among member states. And of course, there is the Paris Agreement as well that influences national climate targets. And then intermediate targets is more or less the same reasons. Then we see that the regulating and permitting of CO2 storage among European Union countries is relatively more advanced. It's of course not perfect, but most of the key points that are missing have either already been identified by the European Commission or are being worked on by the European Commission to provide a very comprehensive CO2 storage legislative framework. And in the case of the UK, it's also quite advanced due to the fact that the UK government has looked at it through many different ways. There's just Switzerland that's lagging behind a little bit because of a more or less rather difficult national legislative framework where regions in Switzerland have the competency to work on CO2 infrastructure, which makes it hard to have a national approach to this issue. And then another bright spot that we saw is research and development spending in general. And this is also reflected in our funding database. And then land-based deployment incentives. We, of course, don't have enough. And this is also something we highlighted in a new funding white paper that we just published, which has been done by my colleague Aloisa, and where we have also identified what the European Union could do to really advance the CDR sector even more through research and development funding. And then finally, what is there to improve? Many things, as you might expect, but especially we found that safeguards against mitigation deterrence, for example, were not in place in almost any country. And this is also linked to the fact that no country has really set separate and quantified targets for CDR. Germany, for example, is developing some through its negative emissions strategy, but there are no countries that have really a set amount of CDR that they need by 2050, for example, which is lacking. And then the use of a like-for-like principle is also not present in national legislations. Then, of course, there's the issue of deployment incentives that's lacking in most countries in terms of providing deployment incentives for durable CDR. And then there's also a more generic reflection around how CDR could fit into long-term compliance markets or more general enduring policies over the very long term. And then finally, across all countries, there's one common trend, which is that justice is the lowest performing pillar, or ensuring a just governance around CDR, most specifically around public participation in decision making, and then how the cost of the transition is shared among citizens, let's say. We have also a new functionality that allows to have very graphical summaries of each indicator. So for each of the 8 indicators, you have also this map function. For example, here we are looking at the indicator 1, which is to develop a dedicated carbon removal strategy. And we can see that only Switzerland is on track, even though there are quite a few countries that show clear signs of progress, like the UK or Denmark. In the case of Denmark, for example, they have a biochar strategy, but they don't have one that comprises other CDR methods. In the case of the UK, they have a very comprehensive CCUS vision that also somehow encompasses CDR or some specific CDR method, but there's not an overall strategy that targets all relevant CDR methods in that country. And just to look at one laggard in this sense, which is Italy, where there's not really any sort of strategic thinking around the use of either CCS or CDR in climate policy. And it's really, yeah, basically, we don't know what they are planning around these types of technologies, which is a big problem. Forgive me. And then I just wanted also to provide a slight deep dive on the case of Denmark, because I think it's a very interesting one, and to show how the indicators are broken down into sub-indicators. So if we first look at supporting research, development, innovation, how that looks like in practice, we have 3 different kinds of sub-indicators. I just go through them one by one. So if we look at the first one, it is to identify the potential of different CDR methods within that country. So that means concretely Denmark is doing some research on how, for example, biochar could be scaled or BECCS could be scaled within that country. And that's dependent on biomass availability, renewable energy sources, etc. So this kind of strategic approach where the country first identifies which CDR method it can do. And then based on this, there's the second sub-indicator, which is to develop a long-term plan or roadmap for research, development, and innovation funding for CDR. And there, Denmark shows clear signs of progress, which means that they do have some sort of roadmap for specific sectors within CDR or specific technologies, but not for the overall umbrella of methods that sit under CDR. And then finally, it has dedicated funding earmarked for relevant CDR methods. So on that perspective, Denmark is on track. And then if we just look at dedicated deployment incentives on the other end, how that looks like in practice, we broke it down into 2 sub-indicators. The first one is to have deployment incentives for more durable CDR methods, like DAX or BECCS. And then the second one is to have deployment incentives for less durable CDR methods, like afforestation or peatland rewetting, for example. And on both dimensions of both sub-indicators, Denmark is on track. On the first one, it has provided already at least like more than 1 billion in total, but closer to 2 or 3 billion to different durable CDR methods through the NS, for example, the CCUS fund that provided 1 billion to Ørsted. And then for less durable CDR methods, through a new political agreement that was adopted last year, I think they set aside at least 3 billion for ecosystem restoration measures, let's say, which include reforestation and, for example, wetland rewetting. So I'm nearing the end of my presentation, and I also have some time for you to ask questions, etc. But just to clarify the next steps beforehand, next steps for policy tracker, of course. So basically, as I said, we mapped funding opportunities in 10 European countries so far, and we will continue mapping funding opportunities in the remaining European countries. So if you go back on our platform periodically, you will see that we add new countries in the scope. which might be relevant for you as well in the future. And then first point. Second point, we will assess policy progress in more countries, which is also one of the questions I have for you, which would be which one should we be focusing on next? Just to give you an idea, on my list, on our list, we have Norway and the Netherlands as the two prime potential next ones that we cover, but there's also Spain or Portugal that we could be looking at in priority if that would be more relevant. And then, of course, we will continue the tracking aspect of the policy tracker, so tracking EU policies, and we'll also expand coverage of other policies as they are being released by the European Commission, for example. As you may know, the European Commission published the Clean Industrial Deal, I think it was last week or 2 weeks ago, 2 weeks ago now. And this will also, of course, be on the policy tracker. And then we will keep monitoring also all other types of policies that will be added. And on top of that, we might add some policies that could be relevant for CDR in the future, but where CDR does not have a place yet. So yeah, a few questions, and then I will leave you the floor, of course. Which countries do you want to see next on the policy tracker? And then if you have any thoughts on which current features are most useful for you or which ones you might want to see next, I would also be very curious to hear that. And with that, I thank you for your attention. And yeah, curious to know what you all think about it and questions.
I would just like to add that if you could tell us, Alexis, where people can submit their the countries they would like to see, how they can get a hold of us. Yeah, if you could just expand on that.
Yeah, sure. So for now, we have, of course, this session, but in the future, we have a space on the policy tracker. If you create an account, you can submit questions to us or submit feedback, and we'll keep monitoring that as well. So yeah, policy tracker or this session itself.
Another question perhaps is, what would you like to see as like the next big policy for carbon removal that we could put on the policy tracker? You mentioned the clean industrial deal. Is there anything else that you see kind of as another big player that would be useful to track?
Yeah, sure. So one of the things I mentioned is this mainstreaming of CDR in existing legislation aspect. So basically identifying existing legislation that are implemented or enforced in the EU and seeing how we could slightly change it to accommodate CDR and to ensure that it actually serves the CDR sector. One example could be to slightly revise public procurement rules to make it slightly more favorable towards CDR. So yeah, all kinds of policies around this. It could also be around disclosure rules for companies. I think this is very interesting, and I'm personally very excited about this.
Thank you. I don't know if we have any other questions in the chat, but please, if anyone does have, please put them in, but maybe in the meantime, we move on to Thibault, and then we can always circle back to you, Alexis, if there's any questions that are specific to this.
Sounds good.
Should I take thank you very much, Alexis. Should I take the floor now or wait a few more seconds for potential questions? Up to you. Okay, well then I will
share. The floor is yours then.
Okay. Give me 1 second. I need to, okay. I will have to leave and reopen Zoom for like 10 seconds, so I'll be right back. Thank you very much. I just need to update my settings. See you in a few seconds.
All right, no worries. Yeah. In the meantime, if there are any other questions that arise, feel free to drop them in the chat. I think there's this Q&A tab where you can ask, or yeah. And if you don't have any questions, that means my presentation was quite complete, so that's also a good sign. But yeah, any questions, feedback, you can always also send it after this presentation. It's not the only forum where we will listen to you. So yeah, excited to see things coming.
We do have a question in the chat, actually. Thank you from Rowan while we're waiting for Thibault.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
while you set it up, I would just reply to this question. So the question is how startups have previously benefited from the data and the tools that we have through the policy tracker. So I think one very concrete example is just around EU policy can be quite overwhelming, and there are a lot of different policies that are being developed. There are many stakeholders around these policies. So one concrete benefit of the policy tracker is to enable startups with limited resources towards policy to just have this done externally rather than, for example, I don't know, maybe paying consultants or to monitor CDR policy. The tracker could be at least a first lay of land, and then to go deeper, that the policy people in these startups can use the tracker as an anchor, basically. And now with the new funding tracker, it can also be used to just keep afloat within the CDR funding landscape, which can be very overwhelming and very hard to understand and to grasp. So we also want to see this funding database as a service to these startups to just basically they can use it to identify relevant funding opportunities. And thank you for the question. Now I think, I can leave you the floor, Thibault. Your time has shined.
Thank you very much, Alexis. I had forgotten to update my Zoom, so now I should be able to share my screen, which is right here. Okay, I hope you can all see the slides. Let me know if you can't. I'm going to try to minimize this. Yeah. So thank you very much. Today I'm going to be talking to you about the uses of carbon removal, and specifically uses that we believe at Carbon Gap to be important for our future to deliver climate impact. And as you will see during this presentation, what Alexis has presented for the past half hour is basically what Carbon Gap is expecting to see in the policy landscape in Europe and abroad in the wider world around CDR. And here is more like the thinking behind why we look for those policies specifically. Why do we think those some users should be prioritized, some users should be developed, and what is our reasoning and thinking around this? So first, this has started, like this question of thinking about CDR users has started at Carbon Gap when the EU Commission first proposed the CRCF, so carbon, I think now it's not carbon removal certification framework anymore, but carbon farming and carbon removal regulation. And when we saw this proposal, so it was around the end of 2022, we were like, this is a great first step, but what is it going to be used for? Because it's great to have a transnational public publicly supported certification framework, but if there is no clarity on who is going to be using it, then basically we're just leaving yet another certification framework open to the market, and then we don't exactly know what is the end purpose of that. And this reflection also came from the fact that, as we saw it and as we still see it, current voluntary practices on carbon markets are very useful, but there is no way they're going to be massive enough to grow the market of carbon removals, both conventional and permanent carbon removals, to the gigaton or multi-gigaton scale that we need by 2050 to make sure that this market delivers on various climate targets that we have, and also on the more general purpose of trying to sustain a livable climate for us and for the entire ecosystem. And so when we realized this, we understood that we had to diversify the way not only us, but the CDR ecosystem generally sees the question of CDR users, which means that basically looking at new demand streams that could emerge to support CDR scale up. And so one of my points here is to say that basically, if we had to draw a very basic origin of this thinking, is that permanent CDR needs new demand streams to support its scale up, because today it's expensive, it's nascent in many ways, and it needs support. Whereas conventional CDR, which has been in place for some years and sometimes some decades, needs to find a new or a clear purpose for its use towards our net zero strategies and towards our net zero future, to make sure that those practices continue and are made more and more sustainable. So basically, the whole point is that we must understand clearly who uses CDR or who should be using CDR, which type of CDR they should be using, and for what purpose. And this is the absolute basis to help the industry grow sustainably, because it's how we can then pressure policymakers or influence policymakers into taking some decisions and building some policies that will actually support those users. So basically, as I said, this work started at Carbon Gap towards the end of 2022, and during the entire CRCF process, which was the CRCF itself was put into European law or made into European law during the year of in May 2024, if I'm not mistaken. And our work on use cases, which started during CRCF, was concluded a few weeks later with this paper, which was published in October 2024, which I'll be summarizing in the rest of this presentation, and which you can find on the Carbon Gap website. So let's start with introducing the way we thought about this, because I think it's important so that people in the ecosystem can understand how we at Carbon Gap see this and how we can support new users of CDR to come to life and basically broaden the market for CDR and the demand for CDR. We started on 3 core principles when we think of CDR use, which is that CDR must be delivering effective climate impact. So by any means avoiding mitigation deterrence. Then it must, it should, as much as possible, deliver positive environmental and social impacts. So this relates to the whole do no significant harm principle, and also to all the co-benefits that many CDR methods have, including permanent ones, that we need to better define and put value to them to make sure that they are well represented. And finally, all the users of CDR today need to contribute to scaling up the CDR industry, because, as I said, it's a must-have for our climate policy and our climate objectives for the decades to come. So this led us to defining use cases, which was not an easy task because it's quite a broad topic to tackle. But the way we chose to look at use cases for CDR is to define it as the purpose for and the way in which various stakeholders will engage with carbon removal activities. And this ultimately links to how CDR is paid for. And this will be very important, as you will see. Thinking about use cases in this way led us to 3 consequences that have allowed us to broaden the spectrum of the way we think of use cases. The first one is that a given type of CDR, so when we say given type, it's like a specific CDR method, let's say, can be used towards different ends. Stakeholders can have different objectives and varying willingness to pay. That means that they can and should use CDR in different ways, and this can increase demand if the regulation and if the framework is here to support those different users and to accompany those stakeholders with those users. Second, CDR is not solely a private sector undertaking, and this again relates to the first consequence, but it's extension of that. Basically, if we say that there are various stakeholders with various objectives towards CDR, then we can look beyond companies that today invest in CDR through the VCM, which plays an important role again. But it means that probably public stakeholders need to take more responsibility towards developing the sector, because they include today in their own strategies a benefit from this sector to achieve their targets. So that is also something to take into account. And finally, the third consequence is that the use case depends on the CDR method used. So it's kind of let's say, an opposite thinking to the first one, but which is equally important, which is that basically we cannot consider all CDR to be equal, which is today still often a bit the case on the voluntary carbon market, and which leads to many practices that have led to either public scandals or a lack of trust in general into carbon markets. And so we believe that if properly managed, those different CDR methods can actually each serve a very important purpose towards our climate goals, while still being developed and supported and scaled up by both public and private actors, as long as there is clarity on who is using what and in which purpose. And so from all this reflection, the work that I'm presenting today serves three goals. The first one is to show that use cases can be diversified to unlock demand streams that today are still constrained. The second is that we believe this work can help develop better governance, which is clear regulation on the public side and also clearer voluntary guidance on the private side to ensure sustainability in the growth of this market. And finally, also showing that flexibility, specifically in the case of certifying carbon removals, can be very useful to suit this variety of users. And so this is what I'm going to be doing here. And then I will go into exploring this diversity of different families of use cases, as I've called them. Here is a visual that we have produced to show and also to kind of make very visible the impact that multiplying use cases could have on creating new demand for CDR. Because what you see on this graph is that basically what exists today as most of the demand for CDR, which is coming from VCM, only represents, in our view, a fraction of what will constitute the overall demand for CDR, or should be constituting the overall demand for CDR in the future. Which means that we need to explore like a variety of new options and deliver on policies to support them in the next few years so that all those users can actually come to life and support the sector. So we have divided this broadly into four families. The first one, as you know, is the current state of play. It's voluntary practices. So compensation and contribution claims and enabled by voluntary carbon markets. The second one, which is starting to be discussed in the EU through a potential integration into the ETS, so emissions trading system, the system that we've been having since 2007, if I'm not mistaken, or the creation of a removals trading scheme, which would then allow the exchange of removal credits separately from the ETS. Basically, this family of use cases is a way of making emitters accountable for CDR scale-up, while also creating a long-lasting demand signal, which is something the sector desperately needs to scale up over the next years and decades. A third family, which is, as I mentioned already, very, very important, is increasing or thinking of direct public demand through dedicated CDR policies. So this can go into public procurement, integration of CDR into policy frameworks in various ways, which we will explore a bit later. And here the idea is that states which have or are starting to set net zero strategies, implying that their remaining or residual or hard to abate, whichever word you want to use, emissions will have to be addressed in one way or another, and also for some of them become net negative in the future. Those states rely on the future existence of a CDR market, and therefore it means that they should be also users of CDR today if they want to be users of CDR tomorrow. So this is also a family of use cases that we have defined and that we explore. And finally, the last one, which may be again, it's something that is already in place, but we want to redefine it as a new family of use cases, is the way we invest in nature restoration, which is rethinking the purpose of what we call conventional or land-based CDR, thinking like inverting the current logic, which is nature is here, or nature restoration activities are here to deliver some tons, and in some cases they can have co-benefits for the ecosystems, for the community, for the environment. Inverting this logic, saying we should invest in nature restoration, and by adapting our ecosystems to climate change, by increasing their resilience, by increasing their biodiversity, we are actually increasing the amount of carbon they can store. And this becomes then a use that decommodifies nature, but still delivers CDR. And we believe it's very important to think about it this way. So I will go very briefly, so I don't take too much of your attention and energy. I will go briefly into those four families and present the main rules or orientations we have on those. And of course, then I will happily take your questions on anything I've presented. First of all, on voluntary compensation, our key question was how to make it sustainable, because today it's something that is being discussed as part of the negotiations on the Green Claims Directive, which should come to life by the end of the semester if current negotiations stay on track at the European level, I mean. But within this framework of green claims, which now we see at Carbon Gap as a complement, a necessary complement to the CRCF to support sustainable practices when it comes to voluntary claims made by companies. We believe first that for compensation, there are four clear principles that should be enshrined in this directive and by extension should be applied by any company or organization doing a compensation claim to make sure that their compensation is actually delivering a climate benefit, is safe from any greenwashing accusation, and actually, contributes to the scale up of the CDR sector in the way that we need to. The first one is that any compensation in net zero claims should only use carbon removal units. So this is the very clear distinction, the most important one to have, or the first one to have between removal units and emission reductions unit, because emission reductions unit, while they can be useful, are much harder to, let's say, account in terms of the climate benefit that they deliver. And in strict compensation claims where it is important to have a ton for ton approach, they are not eligible for that, and they should not be used for that because of this lack of clarity. The second one is that only high quality permanent CDR should be used to compensate for fossil emissions. So Alexis has talked about this a bit earlier. It's what we call the like-for-like principle. It is also something we push for in the Green Claims Directive and which is in the European Parliament's position so far. So hopefully it will make it to the final version of the text. But here, while we acknowledge that the like-for-like principle is important to enshrine, we also realize that to allow for a, let's say, natural growth of the CDR sector, but also with a strong incentive to develop those credits of permanent CDR, the like-for-like principle should be enshrined gradually into the way companies make compensation claims, so as not to create a huge cliff effect at the beginning, for instance, of the enforcement of the Green Claims Directive, which would lead to massive increases or could lead to massive increases in permanent CDR costs and then create disruptions on the carbon markets. So we believe the like-for-like principle is essential, but we advocate for a gradual implementation of this. The third thing we believe is central is that CDR should be restricted to compensation of hard-to-abate emissions at the point of net zero. So basically, as we see it in the EU 2045 or 2050. But today, to allow for those private companies to actually finance the growth of the CDR sector, and especially the permanent CDR sector, we should allow CDR to be used to meet interim milestones on the transition to net zero and to make specific compensation claims in this case on the transition towards net zero. Otherwise, we're just delaying the demand for CDR by 25, 30 years. And when everybody is going to need it, there is going to be no CDR, especially for companies. So we believe that this kind of flexibility is also important. And finally, which is point 4 is the only point that is at least in the EU, ensured by the CRCF as it exists or is currently being developed, is that for those compensation claims, only ex-post and publicly retired CDR units should be used. And so, which is why it's really important that now that we have CRCF that creates those ex-post publicly retired units, we have the regulation that follows, which allows the use of those units, those high quality units in the proper way. Then I'm going to accelerate a little bit so I have time for your questions. Voluntary contribution. You probably have heard of this multiple times as a potential more viable alternative to compensation, which we also explore here because they do indeed constitute a more sustainable, let's say, version of claims than compensations, because they allow private funding to flow towards CDR development while limiting the risk of mitigation deterrence, because by definition, if you do not aim to claim any ton-for-ton benefits on the CDR you purchase, then you are not disincentivized in any way to delay, you're not incentivized, sorry, in any way to delay your emission reduction strategies, which is always a risk that can occur at some point with CDR. So yes, contribution is more sustainable in that sense and creates less issues on, it creates less issues on the question of making sure that claims are actually considered viable by society and by stakeholders in general. But the problem is that they're not yet attractive enough to corporates because there is no either clear regulation guidelines or private corporate guidance that incentivizes or puts value specifically on those claims and allows also for a specific advertisement of those claims. And it's also something that is important to stress as part of the negotiations on the Green Claims Directive, that contribution claims should be properly defined and should be communicated specifically to customers so that it has value. It has an advertisement value and it has value towards customers so that companies are actually incentivized to do those claims. And here again, certification could help mainstream the contribution approach by providing some flexibility, which is if we depart from the ton for ton approach, then we do not necessarily need to have all the tons bought through certification mechanisms towards contribution claims to be of the highest level of stringency when it comes to certifying them, because otherwise it will create a lot of cost barriers to companies trying to engage in contribution and will incentivize them to go to compensation, because if they pay the highest price for the ton, they might as well use it for the use that is the most expensive in a way, which is compensation today. Then moving away from, it's what we call the beyond in our thinking, because we try to go above, beyond basically contribution and compensation, which what exists today and could still grow significantly to support CDR, but we need to think beyond that. We really believe that there is no way CDR will scale up to the gigaton scale if we do not go look beyond those users. So the first thing that comes to mind, of course, was CDR compliance markets, because it can be seen as the natural move away from VCM at some point towards a system in which states acknowledge the necessity for high emitters to have a responsibility in scaling up CDR by creating a market. As I mentioned briefly earlier, it could either be an integration into ETS or a specific dedicated removals market, which would basically create a much more stable demand signal than the current VCM, because companies, or at least a subset of companies, would be mandated to invest on this compliance market. It will also alleviate many reputational risks that we've seen when it comes to engaging with CDR for companies, which have also hindered the growth of the VCM in the past few years. And it would stabilize the demand signal, which is the most important thing for CDR providers, to make sure that they can project the volumes that they are going to deliver over the next few years and decades. And again, it's also, in terms of use, it's a way of acknowledging as a society that emitters need to invest today for the compensation, the future compensation or future repair, in a way, of the emissions that they have caused earlier. But again, as I mentioned already, compliance mechanisms require very careful design. On both sides, on the side of the RTS, there is a risk of placing excessive double burdens on organizations, because if they already face obligations under an ETS, then the RTS would come above the ETS and then could, in some instances, create difficulties for companies to cope with that. But on the other side, if we integrate them in, if we integrate CDR, into the ETS without any guardrails or with insufficient guardrails, then we risk creating a situation where basically both we don't exactly know what we inject in the ETS, and then it can create spikes or problems on the price signal, which we have seen, for instance, in New Zealand, when they injected many carbon removal credits into their ETS. And it can also, if the price of permanent removals goes down, or on some solutions of permanent removals goes down, then it could create mitigation deterrence within a compliance system, which would then creating mitigation deterrence at a national or supranational level, and then become a big problem for our climate efforts. So that to say that states will really need to consider how they approach this, how they approach the construction of compliance mechanisms, and also how they account for the CDR that is purchased and used on those compliance markets, and to solve any accounting issues that they may have between the removals accounted for in the compliance markets and what they count as removals in their national inventories or towards their NDCs. There are some debates around this which are still quite unclear. For instance, how the CRCF units should be used or how other units should be used towards the EU NDC. Hopefully, some clarity brought by Article 6 and by international mechanisms on this will allow for a more clearer way of accounting for all this and allow for the development of compliance markets. Then we look at another family, the third family of use cases, which is direct public demand through dedicated CDR policies. This is some work, I haven't specified this, but at Carbon Gap, we are actively working on defining ETS and RTS models that could be implemented in the EU to create those compliance mechanisms. But we have already published a proposal for a pilot public procurement in the EU for supporting the scale-up of CDR methods today, starting 2025, because we believe it is the role of the state, because of their national climate strategies and the objectives that they have set, especially, for instance, in the EU with the EU climate law, which states carbon neutrality by 2050, which we all know, but also states that the EU aims to be carbon negative or net negative as soon as possible. Then it means that CDR must be, like, there is a responsibility for the EU and for its member states to develop CDR to meet this target. And then the first step towards this is to use public money in the most useful way, which is de-risking some solutions, proving their viability, their scalability. And this means creating a pilot public procurement program, which is something, a proposal that we have developed and that you can find also on the Carbon Gap website. So I invite you to look at this. But basically, public procurement is one element of it. Another element of it could also be revisions of sector-specific policies. For instance, we mentioned this several times, but including CDR requirements in building demolition practices or in building in the building codes, also in infrastructure planning and agriculture. If we embed CDR into existing climate policies, then it will be much easier for the EU to develop this sector to the scale it needs by 2050 or by mid-century. And in this case, again, governments should see the certification mechanisms that we are building or have already built as an enabler for all this, for developing the CDR policies that suit them most, because certification is actually not a tool that is going to be useful only for the VCM or for carbon markets, whether compliant or voluntary. But it can also be used by governments to identify the activities and the methodologies that work and pre-select, for instance, in the case of a public procurement system, the activities that they want to target specifically, the stakeholders or the providers that provide this kind of CDR, and thus saving many administrative costs in scaling up those policies and creating various policies across the EU, but which all serve the same objective. We believe that is really important. And finally, I'm reaching the end of my presentation, I promise. A very important point for us, which is a bit away from the question of scaling up permanent removal, but is, I believe, equally or even more important today for us in the EU, because 99% of the CDR that we produce in the EU is what we call conventional CDR, but we should better be calling investments or nature restoration activities. So investments and nature restoration activities should be completely rethought in a way that actually makes sure that those practices serve the objectives that we have as like EU countries and as societies to protect our ecosystems, to protect our forests, to restore our soils and the diversity that we have in our soils and our forests, and have the added, let's say, benefit of delivering increased carbon dioxide absorptions, rather than seeing it, what is often the case today, the other way around, which is an investment in, for instance, an afforestation project that is accounted, whose value is only accounted for in terms of the amount of tons it can remove. Thinking about it this way, we believe, is not sustainable, because even though it has a huge carbon removal benefit, conventional CDR is still of quite low durability and has a higher reversal risk. So it cannot really support any compensation practices because unless it's for biogenic emissions, but this again is a very specific topic. Most compensation claims that are done today which are relying on conventional CDR are actually of low climate integrity because of that. So it's something we should depart from. And instead, we believe that, investments in nature restoration should become something valued in it, like for itself. So the certification mechanisms should create value to those activities and looking at the co-benefits, not only as co-benefits, but as equal benefits to the one of delivering carbon removal. And it will therefore allow companies that are, for instance, more interested in contribution claims to look at those as investments in general towards an increased resilience towards climate change for our nature and ecosystems. So we believe that basically, again, viewing nature purely as a carbon sink has always the risk of promoting harmful practices, and today does not address the funding gap that we have. So if we move towards this new vision of conventional CDR, then we may be broadening the perspective on this and actually make sure that our forests and our soils are taken care in the appropriate way. Thank you very much. I'm going to stop here and take your questions if you have any.
Thank you, Thibault. This was very in-depth, which I think is a good thing. We don't always have the time to read through reports, and it feels a bit more tangible when the authors themselves come forward and tell us more about their work around this document. And actually, I have a question to you and to the people who collaborated with you on this report. How do you even approach such an issue? So it goes so deep into the concept of use cases is basically one of the main roots of wanting to develop and deploy CDR. But how do you go about addressing then this topic through a report? What is your research approach to kickstart such an initiative?
It's an interesting question. I don't think it's an easy process, and I was very helpful to be assisted and to have worked hand in hand with one of my great colleagues, Francesca Battersby, that you may have, like many of you may have met already, to work on this topic and also to try, like the way we proceeded is first what I showed in the first slides, like, starting with some principles, like what are we trying, what do we see CDR achieving, basically, what are the goals of CDR? And once you look at this, like which consequences do you like draw from that? So, basically, if you have if you see that one specific method should be protected, a bit like I explained with conventional CDR, we need to restrict actually the users on this, or not restrict, but redefine the users on this. But we need to increase or broaden the perspective of users on so many other methods that are only considered through the lens of the VCM for now. And then you're like, okay, but I'm going to be honest here, we were not the first ones to think about this, and many smaller jurisdictions or more, let's say, discrete initiatives have been taken, perhaps like in a specific US state, or some legislative proposals have been made, for instance, in California for specific compliance regimes for CDR. And so it's intelligence gathering, basically trying to look at everything that has been tried or has been proposed, see how it worked out, what were the barriers to this. For instance, when I mentioned the double burden thing on compliance markets, it's something that was a criticism made on the proposal made in California to build a compliance market for CDR and actually led it to failure. So it's also important to keep this in mind when you look at alternative uses. Also take account even if it's, let's say, limited, the experience of people that have tried it already. But then also for instance, on the question of reconsidering nature, I think it's also a question of first relying on work that has been done internally, and at Carbon Gap, we have had the chance to have extensive work done on how to reconsider nature. And So going from there and see, okay, how does this, translate in practice? If we want people to invest in that, like, what does it mean reconsidering nature? It means, okay, it means putting proper value on co-benefits and actually maybe changing the nomenclature around it and not saying it's co-benefits, but saying it's a nature restoration activity which delivers benefits on biodiversity, it delivers benefits on carbon absorption in soils, it delivers benefits on water retention. I don't know. I'm not an expert in that, but the idea is to say, okay, actually this kind of vision that we have can translate into a marketable product that allows for better practices to be implemented like today and tomorrow on the conventional CDR market. That was a bit of a convoluted answer, but yeah, basically looking at what existed, what exists, what has been proposed, and draw from past work and experience.
I appreciate that answer. I think it's an informative one. And actually, I'm going to broaden the conversation a bit more, so the team at Remove can also is actually going to jump in on that one. Someone is asking, what would be the pathways and how could startups engage with organizations such as Carbon Gap, but not only, to help support the development of the CDR policy sector and compliance mechanisms? You at Remove are in touch with on the ground startups that want to grow and want to support this growth. But it's not always easy to know where to start and how to approach enablers. So what would you recommend them?
Yeah, thank you. And thank you, Carbon Gap team, for this amazing work. It's so dense and incredible, and definitely like takes a bunch of brains to get all of this together. So thank you so much for laying it out as well. In terms of startups, so as Remove, we have our community of alumni and we have a huge Slack community. So what we try to do with the likes of Carbon Gap is whenever there is a initiative or like a more initiative that is policy related, that is more action oriented, that benefits startups, we ask startups to engage in that. We've in the past asked some of our alumni to check out some letters of support for certain initiatives, calling on different policymakers, different people in the European Commission to make sure there are separate targets, for example, for carbon removal, things like that. So whenever we get the chance to share this with our alumni, we do. I think I would also like to ask the question to Carbon Gap, are there any ways that you would like startups to engage with you as well, that we could help enable and be connectors for you?
Yeah. Happy to jump in on that, and thank you very much, Raron, for your reply. I think one of the main ways where startup perspectives could be super useful is if we do surveys together to kind of see broader trends and topics that startups care about. We do the same also with a negative emissions platform, which somehow has some overlap with the startups that Remove, but are also slightly more advanced in terms of the TRL level, for example. But yeah, I think surveys for us are super insightful, and we would definitely like to do more of them. And yeah, if we could jointly produce them, that would be great, since you have such a reach on so many startups. But I think that would be one of the main ways.
Yeah, so more around the understanding the startup views and collecting data, that would be helpful.
Exactly.
Okay, great. And I think there was another question that was already answered in the chat by Alexis, but maybe could you double down on how can buyers benefit from this when looking to engage on buying CDR credits in the future? I think they were referring to your platform.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, basically, I think there would be different ways to do so, but the prime function that would be useful for buyers would be probably the policy tracking function rather than the funding tracking option. We have always the next steps, what's on the horizon, what we can expect from different policy developments at the EU level, for example, like the Green Claims Directive, which, as Thibault just mentioned, might have an outsized impact on CDR demand in the future. But also some other policies like the 2040 climate targets, the revision of the European climate law, that might have an outsized impact on CDR demand in general. So that would be one of the prime ways to look at it. And then in terms of what countries are doing, for example, having an overview of what each countries are doing would be very useful for buyers, in my opinion. Also to understand how claims are regulated, even though it's at the European Union level, that might be the most relevant. Some countries are taking a step in advance, so prior to the European Union, like Finland has published some guidelines around claim making within the voluntary carbon market ahead of the Green Claims Directive. So there are also definitely some national components. And then anything that's upcoming as well, just to keep track. There's one functionality which is to subscribe to policy updates on the tracker once you create a user account. And that means that anytime we update that policy page, you will be sent an email saying, hey, we updated that policy. So that also makes it even easier for you to just passively track throughout the tracker.
That's awesome, because my next question was going to be, other than these webinars, how can the people in the audience keep up with everything that's going on at Carbon Gap? So that's one way, which is really cool. If that's something that's interesting to you, you just put your email in to get notified. But what other ways would you recommend as well?
So I think our newsletter, we have a monthly newsletter that's sent partly by Chloe as well. And there we really mention everything that's related to our work, but also big policy developments in CDR in Europe, but also market updates, for example, or what's happening more on the scientific side. So I think that would be one of the key ways. And then, of course, I think Clotilde would agree, follow us on social media. That's always one of the best ways to keep track. Yeah. And then we have also regularly some webinars also with other organizations or places like this where we go deeper into specific topics. So yeah, just stay on the watch for these. And then finally, we have quite a few publications coming as well. So yeah, we definitely, if you don't know what to read, we'll definitely keep you busy in the coming months.
We definitely have resources, and I'll actually expand that, because we're hosting next week an exhibition at the Parliament. So our team will be there, but not just us. Quite a lot of CDR conveners will be on the ground presenting you. The exhibition is on the topic of permanent CDR, and so they will be presenting their solutions, their work. And this is, I think, an excellent way of coming. So if you have access to the European Parliament, I strongly encourage you to join and just pop in at any point next week between Tuesday and Thursday. That's predominantly when we'll be available. Have a look at our resources there. People will be explaining quite a few different concepts, ranging from very concretely the science behind permanent CDR, all the way to policies supporting permanent CDR and how to strengthen them. Earlier during this webinar, we were talking about the like-for-like principle. This is a concept that is strongly intertwined with the durability of a method and how to invest in the correct one depending on the emissions that are being produced. And these events are not just a great way to gather resources and get on the ground knowledge, but it's also just a great way to meet the people behind all of these initiatives and these platforms, who can then put us in contact with other people and expand the network. So do join in. We also have opened the reception to the public. The registration link can be found on our LinkedIn. So you can even come into the launch reception on Tuesday evening if you want. But thank you, Alexis, for spotlighting our newsletter and our social media. We do try to be as available as possible. If you ever message us or email us through those platforms, it goes directly to me personally and my colleague Lydia. So we're very much physical beings behind those chats. So you can be sure that we'll make sure to have a look at your questions, and don't hesitate. We're always happy to put people in contact. We often have our team at Carbon Gap appearing at other events to present our resources and make sure that they're on the ground and meeting all of you conveners, because that's the point. That's what we work for. And that's what we hope to strengthen through our work. I don't see any other questions in the Q&A chat, but is there anything that you two speakers, so Thibault and Alexis, would like to add to your presentations? So we started, I'll recap a little bit. We started with a presentation of the work around our new policy tracker and how it stemmed from, it built upon our previous tracker, the new tools that we've added, keeping conveners and CDR enablers in mind. The point is to make the information as clear as possible so that then it can be extracted and sent elsewhere to deploy and strengthen carbon removal policies. But not just that, we've also focused on national initiatives as well as funding opportunities, because that's what makes CDR stronger and gives it a stronger chance of being deployed and reaching our goals. So that was Alexis' presentation. And then Thibault told us a bit more about use cases and the mammoth that regulating use cases can be, but sometimes the concept of regulation can be overwhelming. It might feel like we're putting barriers and we're slowing down initiatives and innovation. But the idea is also to prepare the floor for what's to come. A lot of what we all do in carbon removal is preparing for potentially, but hopefully, a big deployment, a large deployment of all of these. Sometimes we compare the carbon removal ecosystem, to renewable energies and how it was behaving a few decades ago. It saw a huge boost, and we overestimated the price of renewable energy and such. And so, making sure that use cases right now are studied and are researched and are supported as best as they can now helps make sure that in a few years we have great surprises and we realize that carbon removal is viable and we can deploy it massively to help reach our goals, reach our goals and hopefully exceed them. Net zero, but also net positive is the ambition. And that was Thibault's presentation. I have put the resources in the chat, so you can read the report, you can explore the tracker, you can watch our video series that we've started. Our next episode will be on compliance mechanisms. And hopefully with all of these resources, it helps you decode what is the word in English? The tree, the resources that are available for you. And you can use these tools for yourself. And please don't hesitate, as we've said, to reach out to us, to the team at Remove, because we build upon your work and we build upon what you do. Is there anything else, Thibault and Alexis, that you would like to add or you would like to emphasize from your
Brilliant
presentation?
Summary.
Thank you.
Maybe one thing on my side, which is something I touched upon in my presentation, but I think also in terms of policies to follow today, and it relates to the work, as I said at the beginning of my presentation, the work on use cases is kind of the thinking step or the definition step that then leads to the what makes the policy tracker such an important tool. It's like following all those policies that we are calling for, see how it is coming to life and how it can help define and build the CDR world in Europe, and hopefully then beyond that to see all those users be properly accounted for and have their framework. But one thing that is really important in Europe today and is happening kind of behind closed doors is the definition of methodologies in the CRCF, so the carbon removal certification system that Europe has built, or at least the text is built, and now the Commission and other actors are basically sending out methodologies to make sure that as many CDR methods as possible are accounted for, and that MRV is properly done, that all those requirements that are very technical but are actually properly done. And I think, again, I'm going to reiterate something I said in the presentation, but it's not just for the VCM, it's not just for companies making claims. We really need to see this, we need to be careful about what those methodologies are going to be and make sure that they have all the elements that make like, you know, those carbon credits of high integrity. I don't really like this phrase, but I've struggled to find another one. Because then it will be the support for all other users and policies. And if we have this, the positive way of framing this is that if we make sure that we have this very strong basis, then it's a huge step forward already. Because any kind of policy, even if a member state wants to do a specific policy because there is momentum lacking in the EU, let's, you know, see that future that is possible. But one or two member states want to do something, but then they can rely on this and make sure that they actually fit a broader framework that eventually may extend to other countries and to all of the EU. So it's really important to have this starting basis that is kind of the stool on which all of the users are like supposed to sit. I don't know if this metaphor works, but I'm going to try it anyway. Thank you.
The user stool. We'll use that one. The team at Remove, would you like to add anything to this? We talked a lot about connecting people and not just researching knowledge, but also making it available for everyone. From your perspective, is there anything that you would like to add?
Yeah, so from our perspective, because, you know, we're all about supporting startups who are creating the supply and the enabling infrastructure for the market. So the CDR, we call them the CDR majors of the future. And all, you know, we want to help them do is survive and thrive right now until the market is ready, because the urgency is already there, but unfortunately the entire market doesn't see that. And hopefully we're like in pre-compliance now, so when compliance comes in, then we can be more confident about CDR buyers coming into full effect. But what I would say is we've seen a lot of success when these CDR startups do collaborate, share information, share successes, share how they've gotten the eyes and ears of policymakers where they are, or buyers where they are. Even if they're small wins, they're still wins for the whole CDR field. So sharing is caring, even in the startup world. And it's really great because startups are very agile and would be able to, you know, move very quickly with these learnings. So that's from the startup perspective as well. And obviously we're here to support, echoing as well what Clotilde and the Carbon Gap team said. If you're a startup or you know a startup that's working in CDR, please feel free to reach out to us at Remove. LinkedIn is probably the best way to keep up with our news, and we have remove.global as our website. There's a CDR hub on there where at the bottom you see resources, and actually a couple of resources from Carbon Gap are tagged there as well. And so also, if you're a CDR enthusiast and you're not on our Slack community, feel free to join it. We started as a Europe-based accelerator, but we've expanded. And we are doing India right now with a successful launch. We're launching with Swiss partners to Africa, and hopefully more to come in the coming years. So stay in touch. And if you have any ideas as well, us and the team, myself and Matthias, who's here as well, are always open to hearing.
Thank you. I think with that, we might end this webinar. Thank you everyone for staying till the end. As usual, the webinars are recorded and will be hosted on our YouTube channel, so you can watch them at your own speed whenever you feel comfortable, and share them around if anyone missed this session. Thank you for staying on, and thank you for all of the speakers for taking the time to present their work with us.